In this lesson, we'll look at grids. A grid is a two-dimensional list. It's not a typical data grid, so don't be fooled by that. It doesn't have the concept of rows and columns. It's merely a list shown in two dimensions. There is no native Android data grid, but you can use a custom list adapter to simulate one. We'll discuss custom list adapters in the next lesson, but in fact we'll actually be using one a little bit in this lesson. A grid is commonly used for displaying image thumbnails. Let's start to take a look. The first thing we need to do is we need to create a custom adapter. In this case, we're going to call it an image adapter because we're going to populate it with just images. It descends from base adapter, and we're using images, so we're looking for drawables as our list item. When we talk about custom adapters, we'll describe this a little bit more. I've created two constructors. They're both basically the same, except one actually sets the proper parameters and one uses default values. So let's take a look at the one we're going to actually use. We're going to pass in the context, which is going to be the activity that we're using the grid on. And then we're going to pass in our desired cell height and cell width, and the image view scale type. And that's, if you remember image views, that's whether we're going to center it or crop it or fit it X, Y. So we set those properties, and then we also create a property for our list of images, and that's simply just going to be a getSet, and you can see in the constructor we actually newed that up. Then we have some overrides for the count of items and an accessor by index and a accessor essentially by method. And then finally we get to the good stuff, the getView method. The getView method is called every time we're going to set an item display. So it'll provide us a position, the view, and a parent, which in this case we're not really using. So we first check to see if we've already built this, and if the converted view is null, that means that we haven't already built it and we're not refreshing it. So it doesn't already exist, so we need to create it. So we'll be creating an image view object dynamically, as opposed to it already existing in a layout. And we'll create it dynamically and pass it in our context, which is our activity that we've got this grid on. Then we'll just check to make sure that the parameters make sense. And we'll create a new grid view layout parameter, which will set our image view layout parameters. So this is just defining the cell width and the cell height for the image, which we're going to translate into being the image height and width. Then for the image view, we'll set the scale type with the scale type parameter that was passed in the constructor. Finally, we'll take that image view and we'll set its drawable with the image at this particular list position, which was passed in as a parameter of this method. And finally, we'll return the image view. So this method is really saying, in the general adapter, please give me the view that we're going to use for this particular item. In this case, it's going to be an image view, and it's just displaying the image that we're passing in. The rest of the code is much simpler. In main XML, we merely drag in a grid view. And most of this is defaults, but we have a property called column width, which I've defined as 48 pixels. You can define the column width to whatever is appropriate for your particular grid. I've also set number of columns to autofit, which means that if they turn the device landscape, it will expand the number of columns. So instead of 3 columns, I may end up with 5 columns of thumbnails. And of course the number of rows would go down. So in that way you can see it's not at all like a data grid. It doesn't define the number of columns. And I have vertical spacing and horizontal spacing between the images, and a stretch mode, which is the stretch mode of how the individual views within the grid cells are going to work. And then finally the grid itself is going to be centered horizontally. In the activity, I have a variable for the grid view, and in the onCreate, I'm going to populate it with thumbnails. I find the view by ID for the grid, and then I start creating an image adapter. So I first new it up, passing in this activity as its context, the height and width, and the scale type, and I'm going to fit these images to the center of the cell. And then I'm going to use the image adapter's images list, and I'm just going to end up adding images. And these are just standard Android drawable images that are already available, so I didn't add anything to the project. It's just for an example. It's obviously not what you would normally do. And finally, I set the grid's adapter to the image adapter. We'll run this. And there's our grid of images. And they're all selectable, and the selection events work just like a list selection events. That's how to work with a grid, and we started looking at a custom list adapter. We'll continue with list adapters in more depth in the next lesson.